Today's very special guest is 1986 Indianapolis 500 winner and three-time CART champion Bobby Rahal. Along with former late-night talk show icon David Letterman and businessman Mike Lanigan, Bobby is a principal in Rahal Letterman Lanigan Racing, where he has overseen the growth of the team from a one-car program to a multi-car, multi-discipline organization. Along with his leadership of Rahal Letterman Lanigan Racing, he is the founder and chairman of the board of the Bobby Rahal Automotive Group, a string of car dealerships in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Bobby Rahal, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
Thanks, Chris. Good to see you. Good to be with you.
Good to see you, sir. Really appreciate your time. I know we're in racing season now, so I appreciate your time away from the track.
My pleasure.
So, Bobby, obviously racing is a huge part of your life and your very being. Mm-hmm. What got you into racing, and what has kept you involved in the sport and business of it all more than 50 years later?
Yeah, well, very fortunate. My father raced in the Midwest in SCCA, which is road racing, on an amateur basis. So circuits where we even race still at today, Road America, Mid-Ohio, events like that. My father raced on those circuits starting in the late 50s. And, you know, I grew up all through the 60s. I was a teenager and graduated high school in 1971. And, you know, just grew up around racing as an amateur family, amateur effort on our part. But nevertheless, grew up around it, went to races, saw the greatest drivers in the world race at places like Road America, the Can-Am series, and what have you. And of course, for me, it was a dream, although I frankly never thought I had a chance, because in my family, you got your education, which I did. I graduated from Denison University. And then you got a job, and hopefully it was a good enough job that if you wanted to go racing, you could afford to buy a race car and off you go. I was fortunate that in between my sophomore and junior year, and then junior and senior years, my father had an old Lotus racing car, and he asked me if I wanted to get my amateur racing license, which of course I jumped at, and started winning some races. And when I graduated in 1975, I thought, what's 1 year out of my life? Let's see how far we can go with this. And that was 1975. So it's been a heck of a ride since then.
Hell of a run, Bobby. So it seems like most professional race car drivers these days, and especially in NASCAR ranks, start driving even before their teenage years. More and more are driving professionally at top circuits by the time they're 18 or 19 years old. You know, you mentioned how that wasn't the case back in your days. You went to college. Right. Why has racing changed in terms of the age of drivers?
Well, you have to what created the way it was when I was coming up, obviously prior to me, is that the definition of an adult was based on the voting age, and the voting age in the prior to 1972 was 21 years old, and so you could not enter. The insurance companies wouldn't cover. You couldn't get licensing until you were 21. And, you look at, for example, Graham, he started racing Indy cars at 18. He started racing cars at 14. And, of course, that wasn't even a concept for me. Now, in 1972, they changed the voting age to 18, and to a large degree because of the war in Vietnam, where a lot of the young soldiers going overseas to Vietnam were 21 and younger, 18, 17, 19. And so the idea was, old enough to fight, but not old enough to vote. And so that got changed in 72 to 18. And of course, I started racing in 73, and I was 20 years old at that time.
So you've raced a number of different types of cars. How'd you earn your first ride in an Indy car?
Well, interestingly, I had, of course, my father helped me in the very beginning, but by 1975, I'd gone out and frankly sold myself to a number of companies and people, and that was tough. That was a tough sell in those days because we'd just gone through the fuel crisis in '74, and 73, and it was hard to convince a company to give me money to go racing when there's lines of cars, around the block waiting for a couple gallons of gasoline. one of the people that I met and befriended was a fellow named Jim Truman. Jim started the Red Roof Inn hotel chain. He was based in Columbus, Ohio. I was going to school just east of Columbus at Denison University, so we got to know each other. And really, every year after 75, he was a sponsor of mine to some level or another. Never the whole sponsorship, all the sponsorship necessary to run, but always meaningful. And we just developed a very close relationship. And in 1981, at which point, frankly, my career could have maybe ended just as easily as gone forward by the end of 81. And he came to me and he said, if you're smart, you'll say yes to everything I say. And of course, I'd known Jim for 6 years by that point, and Red Roof Inns was really starting to boom. And he said, I want to start an IndyCar team. I want you to drive the car. You need to help me put the team together. You need to go find people to buy the engines in the car. I'll put up the sponsorship. And boy, that was the best offer I'd ever had. And so at the end of 1981, I moved to Columbus, Ohio, and we began the search for personnel, and I went out and found people to buy the engines and the cars, and by early spring of '82, I was an IndyCar driver.
What's that process like, going out and asking people to sponsor or to buy engines and to buy cars? It's almost
Well,
like
I went to people that I had gotten to know in other categories of racing that I'd been in. So you're kind of dealing with a friendly audience anyway, right? Because they love racing, they're in racing themselves, and sometimes it would be them and two or three other buddies would buy one engine, or So it wasn't easy, but as I say, you were talking to a sympathetic audience, and we were able to put the ownership together. I won't say easily, but in a short period of time, really, in about maybe 5-6 months, we are able to get it all done, and those guys were so critical to my the success I had, because we used those engines for 3 years. They got a percentage of prize money back. They actually earned a little bit of money through, because we had a lot of good results in those first 3 years. And so, in any event, it all came together pretty quickly, and as I say, it was a pretty magical time in my life.
In general, how did you prepare for races, both mentally and physically?
I think racing is certainly a very physical sport, probably underappreciated by many, who think it's like driving their streetcar, which is nothing like driving a streetcar. Mentally, I think it's especially at a place like Indianapolis, the mental demands are tremendous. The physical demands are not as great at Indy as they say on a street circuit, or maybe on a 1 mile oval, but the mental demands are greater because you're racing for so long. So I was the first driver to win the 500 in under 3 hours. So most of the time it's over 3 hours long, and that's a long time in a race car. And of course you have to be concentrating 100% over the course of that race, and that's whether you're in a pit stop or whether you're under yellow caution flag or whatever. You cannot really let your concentration vary. So I think the some of that comes from just starting to drive long races. You develop that ability to focus like that. I think some of it is maybe comes naturally to a degree. Physically, of course, you're working out a lot. If you look at the guys that are racing in Indy cars, especially now, because those cars don't have power steering like NASCAR and Formula One has. The steering effort is very heavy, and these guys, I bet you the body fat percentage is 8% or less on every driver out there, and these guys are true athletes. So, at my time, it wasn't quite as demanding because we didn't have the performance like you have today. but still, you had to be fit, and that was so critical because if you got tired, your concentration would vary, would weaken, and that's how you had accidents. Is when you're not keeping your eye on the ball, as they say. So it was always a case of a lot of physical training, a lot of course, just mental training, doing what you could to improve your ability to concentrate.
I've been blessed to go to a few of your races and see Graham. And to your point, Graham is a tall, lean, lanky guy, and most IndyCar drivers like that. I'm thinking it's hot as hell in those cars. It's hot as hell in the track. They're there, to your point, for 2+ hours, 2.5 hours. What do they do leading up to that race in terms of staying hydrated, in terms of having enough protein in them? Like what's involved in that?
Oh, yes, they're the week before. That's all they're doing is hydrating, eating right, getting their rest, getting their sleep. To me, I thought it would take 4 or 5 days in advance of the race to really get myself ready for it. That was being rested, as I said. That was eating correctly. That was still working out, but obviously not to the point of fatiguing yourself too much. I used to ride bikes a lot, on the country. That's how I trained to a large degree. It's like any athletic endeavor. You have to prepare yourself for it. And, unlike almost maybe every sport out there, there's no timeouts. There's no TV timeouts. There's no commercial timeouts. There's no, as I said, even in the pit stops where your pit stop might be 7 seconds. That's a place where you can gain positions if it's a great pit stop and you do your job as a driver. But conversely, you can lose time. So it's not like you can go into the pit stop and kind of daydream for a little bit and then get going. And of course, in my day, you didn't have speed limits in the pits like you have today. So in Indianapolis, you're entering the pit lane at over 200 miles per hour.
Jesus.
So, you really had to keep your wits about you.
So we talked about the physical aspect of it, but mentally, to your point, you're pulling at 200 miles an hour, back then, but today there's speed limits. But even coming into a corner, you're a centimeter or a millimeter from hitting somebody, hitting the wall. Like, how do you just mentally do that 200 times? Well, times 4 for each corner.
Well, I mean, again, it's the discipline, really. It's everybody makes mistakes during a race. It's just the degree of the mistake. And obviously, the small, you don't want any big ones, because if you have a big mistake, usually that means you've hit the wall or you've hit somebody else. But everybody's, you're pushing, the car, and maybe you get a little bit wide in a corner, and okay, I'm not going to do that again. Or now I know I can't take it that way. I have to approach the corner differently, or what have you. So it's always, during the course of the race, it's kind of a learning experience as well, because you are, when you in practice and what have you, you're out there, maybe you might run 20 or 30 laps in practice at some point just to see what the car is going to be like in the race. But in the race is going to be 100 laps, or Indianapolis is 200 laps. And so you're always, you're trying to develop a car that will respond to what you want to do with it over the course of the race, because the track changes, the temperature above changes, the traction, in the track changes, the line, as I say, changes. So you really are learning every lap. You're learning something new about the track on that given moment, or the car, the car's tires. And of course, the whole idea is the person who can best take advantage of everything the track can give and the car can give you, then you're going to win races.
We've mentioned Indianapolis a few times so far, and everyone knows the Indy 500 is the pinnacle of motorsports. It's the Super Bowl, if you will.
Yep.
What year did you first qualify for the Indy 500, and how did your rookie race go?
Well, I was a rookie in '82, we qualified okay, not great, but we were a new team. Everyone on the team came from road racing. None of us had any oval track experience. We went to the first race that year at Phoenix, Arizona, and fast 1 mile oval. And I'd driven Grand Prix cars, Formula One cars. I'd driven Le Mans. I'd driven Can-Am cars. I'd driven a lot of fast race cars. And I went to Phoenix, and it's like I'd never done anything. I mean, this was so, you looked at it, and, hey, it's an oval, all right? There's two left-hand corners, big deal. Well, then you find out that there's an art to that, and there's in the way you set the car up, and all this knowledge really that these veterans had was of such great value. And here I am, I was 29 years old, but again, never having driven an oval, so and none of us on the team had experience with ovals, and we left that race. They caught me fire on the first pit stop, caught me on fire. That was the end of our race. We were shell shocked when we left that race that day, because it was like, oh my God, and there was going to be one more race in Atlanta Speedway, and then it was Indy, and it was like, oh my God. I mean, we came back to Columbus, Ohio, and with our tails between our legs, and thought, holy smokes, this is different than we thought, and we didn't even go to the second race. The team manager, a fellow named Steve Horn, really made the right call and said, no, we're not going to go. We need to get our act together so when we go to Indy, we're prepared. And we brought an engineer in by a guy by the name of Lee Dykstra, who'd been one of the top engineers in racing of all types since the 60s. And he certainly taught us a lot. And, of course, in the race, we qualified okay. I think maybe on the 9th row or somewhere around there, or 8th row. But in the race, everything started to click. And I was racing, actually, this is the year that Gordon Johncock barely beat Rick Mears at the line. And I was running fourth. I was battling Al Unser Sr. I think we were 4th and 5th at the time. And with 10 laps to go, my engine broke. And so that was that. And I didn't win the Rookie of the Year in Indy that year. But I think what happened during the race, just I clicked with the car, the race itself. I really started to feel comfortable in it. And from there on out, we were pretty competitive in every race after that.
All right, now let's talk about your Indy 500 victory in 1986.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it's something you never get tired of talking about. I know I would. The race was supposed to be held the previous weekend, but was rained out.
Right.
What does a delay like that do for your nerves? And are you able to just set things aside for a week, or does the pressure build up?
Well, we sat there for 3 days, and there were times when we were in the car getting ready to go, and then it started raining again. And so it really was, it was like your emotions were like on a yo-yo, I mean, it was, you're up, down, up, down, up, down. And I have to say, I was so relieved when the word came out. I can't tell you what, it might have been like a Tuesday night. The race is held on a Sunday. It might have been Tuesday night. And they said, nope, that's it. We're going to delay till next weekend. So I went back home to Columbus, and I played in the Muirfield Memorial Tournament Pro-Am. That kind of just cleared my mind. Just getting out of Indianapolis just kind of allowed me to kind of relax a little bit. And so we went back the following weekend and was ready to go. And of course, we were also, for those of us in the team, our mentor, the man who got us all together, Jim Truman, had been diagnosed with colon cancer about 2 years previous. And he was going to turn 50 years old on the original date of the race, or the 25th of May. And of course the race is postponed, and he was really in bad shape. And he made it to the race the following weekend. And of course, all of us in the team knew that, the end was near for him. And I don't think nobody said, hey, we got to win this there was no win one for the Gipper, speech. But clearly everybody kind of knew what was at stake. And they qualified 4th for that race. So we were in a good spot. And in the end, it was a great race. Ultimately, for much of the race, it was Rick Mears and I, and then battling, and then Kevin Cogan came in at the end of the race, and we had to restart with 2 laps to go. I was able to get by Kevin, and then we set the fastest lap of the race on the last lap. So, a great victory for us. Bittersweet because of Jim's condition, and in fact, he ended up dying about 9 days later.
Whether the race is run as scheduled or is postponed like this one, there's always pressure and anticipation. How do you channel that and turn it into an advantage rather than a liability?
Well, as I said, I mean, of course, there were other races I've driven in the past where you sat around and watched it rain for 2 days. And of course, this is only on the ovals. On road courses, you race in the rain. And then you might get a 30-minute practice session, no qualifying, and off you go. So, we've done that on more than one occasion. Again, it's all about preparing yourself and putting yourself in an environment where you can really focus I always like to, especially before a race, the morning of the race, I try to get by myself for like 45 minutes or so and just be alone and kind of gather my thoughts. Think about the race, obviously, but just kind of get myself in a position, mentally, that I wanted to be in before I'd walk outside and get in the car. And I think that kind of developed over time, but that kind of protocol. I think I wasn't a person who could be out glad handing up to the last second. I had to have my private time, and I think people respected that and let me have that, and I think it paid off.
And when you have your private time, you said you're thinking about the race. Are you picturing yourself going through turns and in different scenarios and situations?
Well, more just thinking about the car, thinking about the way you last left it, the handling of it. I was never really that optimistic. In fact, I always tell people if I'm in a bad mood, that's a good sign. Any race I ever went into where I felt, oh yeah, this is going to be our race. It wasn't such a good result. And then there were some races I got into, I thought, oh, this is going to be horrible, and I ended up winning them. So, now you're just thinking about, who's around you, the drivers that you've qualified with, who you can trust, who you can't, who's ultra aggressive, who's fair, most of the guys at the front of the grid are that way. They're fair. Rick Mears, I think, is one of the most fair drivers out there. Allenser Jr. It's just, again, kind of thinking about just the whole package and not just one individual thing.
It's often said, that winning the Indianapolis 500 changes a driver's life forever. And I've actually heard you say that yourself.
Yep.
How did it change your career and your life?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I never really aspired to the 500. Growing up, I was a sports car guy, a road racer. My hero in Indianapolis in the 60s was Jim Clark and Dan Gurney, because those guys were in Formula One. They were in IndyCar. They drove Ford GTs. They did everything. And I always admired that in a driver, that the drivers who could win in anything. Mario Andretti was that way. He could win in whatever the car he was in. And so I was, I kind of didn't really, and I wasn't that interested in ovals, really. In fact, the only time I was at Indy at the Speedway was in 1965. I went with a friend of mine and his father down there to watch practice, and I never again went to that until 1982. Now, having said that, I of course, when Jim Clark won the 565, and you had so many European drivers, Jackie Stewart and Graham Hill and others from Europe came over and were very, very competitive. Mark Donohue, who drove for Roger Penske, and he won in '72. It was like, yeah, I see those road racers. They're better than all those round oval track guys. So I was kind of chauvinistic, I suppose, about road racing. As I said, when I went there in '82, then you find out, holy smokes, this is a very different world, and there's a lot of skill out here with these guys. And I was thinking road racing was better than oval track racing was really pretty arrogant on my part. Um, but so I don't know. I mean, it's uh, the as you said, I think for a driver, at least for a open wheel driver, winning Indy just changes everything. You immediately become, you have more value as a driver, financially more value. Other teams are, now want to be associated with you. Sponsors want to be associated with you that probably wouldn't give you the time of day, 3 hours earlier, right? And now they all want your name and number. I really think I have to say, and AJ Foyt said at one time, and I kind of doubted it, and he said, that winning Indy is far more meaningful than anything else you could win. And of course, he won it 4 times, but I was kind of like, oh, I don't believe that. But you find out that it is true, and it really kind of creates, or you really become immortal because you're always introduced. Every time it's now been 30, well, it'll be 40 years in 26, right, when I won. I'm never introduced as a 3-time IndyCar champion, right? Or at least at the first part of the introduction. It's always the 1986 Indy 500 champion. And they don't say, oh, and he only won 1 race. The fact that he just won it was good. And then they say, oh, by the way, he did win 3 IndyCar championships, which frankly is harder to do than winning 1 individual race. But that's just the impact of the 500 and what it does to you and to your career. And so it changes your life professionally and it changes your life personally.
I'm laughing because I think that's how I introduced you on the show. I'm 99% sure that's what I said.
Yeah. There you go.
So, Bobby, right before the break, we were talking about the Indy 500 and your win. And I assume that 1986 win has to be your most memorable race. But what other races stand out as favorite memories for you?
Well, I mean, for sure, Indy, especially because of Jim Truman's health or lack of health. And this was a guy that played such a huge role in my life in racing. He was at times he was like a father. At times he was a friend. At times he was a mentor. He really fulfilled a lot of different roles. So to see him there, and I guess the best thing that came from that also is in the end we won the race, and so he got to. I'm not sure I'd say he enjoyed it, but he got to win, and that was important to him. And it's not often that you get the chance to win, or you get the chance to realize a dream for someone else. But we did as a team, and I think that's what made it super special for us. But probably the next most personally meaningful race for me was the 1987 Sebring 12-hour race, which is a 12-hour endurance race. My father had raced there in the late 60s, early 70s. I had been there. I was all through high school then. I'd been there and helping him. In 72, I went down for spring break. I crewed for a Canadian team. Sebring to me was such an amazing track. Even today, Sebring is just very special to me because of that. Because of that relationship with my father and what we did there. And so I was fortunate to win that race in 1987 with one of the factory Porsche drivers, a fellow named Jochen Maas, great guy. And so to win that race, again, that may not have been. Now, in some people, particularly those who follow sports car racing and endurance racing, winning Sebring is a big deal. But in the general public, maybe certainly not as well known as Indy. And yet, for me, from a personal standpoint, that race was extremely, what's the word I want? I'm just so proud and happy that we can put that one on our resume, right? And of course, winning the Daytona 24 Hours, similar kind of feeling. So I felt very fortunate that we were able to achieve that, and Yeah, that's probably the next most satisfying and gratifying race that I had after Indy.
I think you're certainly the first and probably the only person to ever say to me that they've gone to Sebring for spring break to crew.
Yeah, well, for part of spring break. I still managed to get down to Lauderdale afterwards, but
All right, there you
yeah.
go.
So
Priorities.
it wasn't all work.
All right, good. Bobby, obviously the cars have changed dramatically from the time you were driving to today, and particularly when it comes to safety. Knowing what you know firsthand about the Indy cars of the 1980s, would you have wanted your son, Graham, to drive one? And would you share the milestones in the safety evolution?
Well, first off, I don't know if he'd fit in one of the old cars. I was tight. I'm 6 feet tall. I was tight. I might have been the tallest driver in IndyCar at the time. There was another fellow named Chris Meek who was like 6'3" or so, but he didn't race that long in IndyCar. I think in part because he didn't fit in them. Graham's like 6'3" or so, maybe even 6'4". Since my day, the cars have gotten a lot bigger inside, internally. So guys like Graham can drive them and drive them safely. I never had seats. I sat on the car. Which probably accounts for why my back is killing me all the time and everything else. But, there were cars in 1990, the Indy car I had, if it kept going, if it kept getting smaller, it's doubtful I would have continued because I wouldn't have fit in it. And of course, in those days also, they didn't have safer walls. And, all the things that, I don't know if we take them for granted today, but when you look at Indy between, say, from 1982 to today, it's really a different racetrack because of the safer walls, because of the strength of the race cars, the safety, the halo, the cockpit that was mandated a few years ago, which is really protected the drivers from things hitting their heads, what have you. Over the years, there's been more than a few drivers that have died because a front wheel would have hit their head. And today, with the halo, that's just not possible. And of course, fire issues, you don't have those like you used to have. So, racing today is thankfully so much safer than it was, and the tracks have really kind of kept pace with that. So you really got the two entities, the race cars themselves and the circuits themselves, really combining to making it pretty safe. People can still get hurt, unfortunately, but I don't think that'll ever go away to a large degree. But today's a pretty good time to be a race car driver in Indy cars, especially.
And Graham's got to be 6'4". I'm 6'3", and I look up at him. So
yeah, I know.
I'm getting older, not shrinking that much yet.
Yeah, I know. I agree with you. I agree.
So on March 10th, the 2024 racing season began. And once it starts, obviously, it's hectic and nonstop as you go from track to track all across the country.
Mm-hmm.
I talked a little bit before the show about this. What happens during the off season? Do you and the team members get much of a chance to close things down, rest up, relax?
Well, Chris, racing is 24/7, 365. It's you're always doing something. You're always exploring. You're always trying to maybe break some new ground. You're always trying to find that. What's that? How do you create the edge? How do you create that one thing, or maybe a couple little things that is going to make the difference? And that's, that's just time consuming, and it's the amount of effort that people in racing give. Either off season, or off the racing weekend, the weeks leading up, the days leading up to a race. There's still constant work going on. So it's, I would just say this: if you're a mechanic or whatever, you're not going to get rich, on an hourly wage basis, because it asks a lot of you, and it asks a tremendous amount from your families. And now there's a passion that, people involved in racing are in it because they have a passion for it. And I think if you ask anybody in NASCAR, drag racing, Formula One, they're in it because they love it. They're not in it because it pays the best. And so that drives you. And it really, when you hear people saying, "Well, I want to thank the wives of the drivers, or children," I mean, because they're in it whether they want to be in it, and it's tough. It's really a tough business, but the joy of winning really overcomes a lot of that. Doesn't probably do away with it all, but certainly certainly offsets a lot of the pain. And that's why, of course, in IndyCar racing we race 17 times a year. The NASCAR guys are racing 30 some times a year. It's crazy. I don't know how they do it, but nowadays, if you're not in the car testing, you're in the car racing. If you're not in the car racing, you're making appearances on behalf of sponsors, away from home. You're going to conventions, or you're going here, you're going there. So, yeah, you might have 17 races, say three days a week on average, with the exception of Indy. So you're at 51 plus 21, say 72 days. But then when you start adding everything else in, more than half the year you're gone from home, and that's tough. But again, when you go into this world, you that's part of the deal. And if you don't like it, then I guess you got to go find something else.
So I mentioned earlier, I've been fortunate to be at a few of your races and had a pretty good look up behind the scenes of what happens.
Mm-hmm.
There's a small army in your team, all behind the scenes, not just the pit guys, but there's people in the garage and the shop. To your point, there's marketing, there's communications, there's sponsors, there's entertainment.
Yep.
How many people are involved in the organization?
Well, right now on our IndyCar side, because as you know, we have also run BMW's racing program for them here in North America. That program, we probably have, I want to say 40 people associated with that program. IndyCar, we're around 90 people now, maybe even a little bit more. And now, we're kind of changing the way we do some things, where now we have kind of what I call mission control at our new headquarters in Indianapolis. And so we leave a number of our engineers back at the ranch, so to speak, and they're hooked up. So real time, they're watching not just what's going on from the video, but they're getting all the data from the car. They're getting all the trackside data from the sanctioning body. And so more and more, we're able to really strengthen our engineering performance each and every weekend by having 5 or 6 people, maybe even a few more, back in the factory, helping those on site, even though they may be 1,500 miles away. So there's a lot. It's the tip of the iceberg, right? The tip is the crew, the driver, and then everything else you don't see, but there's a lot of people involved.
There are a lot. So a few minutes ago, we were talking about the changes of the cars, and the specs for the cars obviously change from year to year. How's the team adjust to those changes? Like the new hybrid engine coming out this year, and then how do you determine whether they make your cars faster or slower before the racing season starts?
Well, theoretically, it's supposed to make it faster. And that's a matter of, okay, how much faster? We just finished a 3-day test at Indy, where Graham drove one day. Pietro Fittipaldi, one of our drivers, grandson of the famous Emerson Fittipaldi, he drove one day, and then Christian Lundgaard, who's driven for us the last 2 years, he was in the car the next day. And I think we all came away feeling pretty happy about where we were, because we hadn't had much time. We hadn't had any time with the hybrid system. But luckily, all the drivers have had experience with the hybrid system in other cars. So it was, I won't say it was easy, but, these guys are pretty sophisticated. And, and luckily, our guys did a good job. Our engineers, because the car weighs more than it did because of all this extra, equipment, and that can alter how a car handles. So because of the weight distribution, so our engineering guys did a great job in bringing to the track a car that was pretty much right on. And so now we leave that test with a lot more knowledge and probably a little more confidence about where we are with this program than we might have had going in.
I mentioned earlier that your team runs a multi-car IndyCar team. Now, I'm not sure what you can share with this. It might be a little inside baseball for RLL, but obviously each individual driver wants to win the race.
Mm-hmm.
Each team wants to win the race.
Mm-hmm.
Are there team strategies, individual strategies, a combination of both?
Well, I mean, certainly my view has always been, I don't have a favorite as to who wins. Our team, my favorite is for the team to win. Naturally, you'd like all four of your cars at Indy to be running 1, 2, 3, 4. Then it's up to the guys on the track. But the caveat to being is don't take your teammate out. That's inexcusable. And if the guy wins and you're second or you're third, you got to still feel very good about it, and your time will come. But you can't. You've seen it in NASCAR. You've seen it in even in some IndyCar events where two guys in the same team take each other out, and that's just that's the worst possible thing that can happen. So, I'm all for, hey, may the best man win, but he's got to do it in a clean way. He can't be taking out or putting at risk any of his teammates.
So, spoken like a true parent, you love all your children equally.
Exactly. Exactly.
Bob, you've been responsible for finding and developing some of the top young talent in open wheel racing, including your son, Graham. Include among your proteges are Danica Patrick, two-time Indy 500 winner, Takuma Sato, 2014 Indy 500 winner, Ryan Hunter-Reay, 2004 Indy 500 winner, Buddy Rice, Brian Herta, Max Pappas, 99 500 winner, Kenny Brack, Jimmy Vasser. The list goes on and on and on. How do you evaluate a driver's talent and potential? And then assuming that the other team owners also see what you see, how do you get them to sign with you?
Well, I don't know if I would take credit for discovering all those people. Certainly, Danica, I think, although she had been recognized by Ford at the time, but she was over racing Formula Ford in England. But I met her there, and I think she would even tell you that my faith in her is what gave her that shove up the ladder that she needed. And there have been others that we've seen who maybe people had washed their hands of. Ryan Hunter-Reay, for example. I mean, he was really kind of at the end of his rope. Same thing with Buddy Rice. We recognize that they had talent, and they had a lot of talent, and maybe they weren't in the right environment, or the right team, or what have you. Takuma, of course. Takuma was in Formula One. He'd been in Indy cars. He drove for us in 2012. Then he left. Then he came back in 18, I think it was, something like that. He ends up winning the 500 in 2020. Now he's back with us again for this year. That's kind of like it's been an amazing relationship with Takuma. I love Takuma because he's just got such passion. And that's what you look for. And you want people who, they just have the passion. They want, they don't want to be anywhere else. They want to be right where they are, and that they'll do whatever it takes to improve themselves, and to really generate the kind of commitment that not only does a team want, but they need to have in order to make it successful. Danica did a fantastic job for us. Sorry to see her leave when she went to Andretti. But what an amazing experience that was, to see her go from someone no one knew anything about to being one of the most popular athletes in the world, really, in a very short period of time. And, we see each other every now and then, and I think we still, that was a special time. But in the end, it's all about commitment. It's all about desire, all those kinds of things that you have to succeed as a driver. Because, to be honest, you're going to be unsuccessful a lot more than you're going to be successful. And it's how do you react to that, and how do you respond? Do you, skulk away and feel sorry for yourself, or you just become more determined that that's not going to happen the next time, or you're going to improve yourself, and that's what you're looking for. you're really looking for people who will do whatever it takes, to get to the top.
In addition to your son Graham, this year's Rahal Letterman Lanigan team has some young but very seasoned talent. You mentioned Christian Lundgaard before, Pietro Fittipaldi. Christian will be starting his third full season in IndyCar. Pietro has had 6 IndyCar starts in 2018, and Graham will be starting his 19th year behind the wheel of an IndyCar. Makes him like the grandfather of Indy right now, I think.
Yeah, pretty much.
Don't tell him I said that, though.
Well, there are older drivers, but not many. I think Dixon's been around a lot longer. Of course, Tony Kanaan, although I think he retired this last. I mean, there's a few that are, willpower, but when you start at 18, that's
sneaks up on you.
Yeah, you can do a lot of races in 17 years.
What are your expectations for each of them this year and for the team as a whole?
Well, as you know, last year we had a very good second half of the year last year, but our first half was not so good, and of course the low light of that period was Graham not qualifying at Indy. In the end, he was able to get a ride with Dennis Reinbold, a good friend, but unfortunately had problems, couldn't start before the race. So anyway, but for him not to qualify, this is a guy who was on track to win the 500 3 years ago, and has always been pretty competitive there. And of course the other two guys, both Jack Harvey and Christian didn't have really strong cars. I mean, as a team, we let those guys down. And so a year ago, the day after the race, I went to our management and I said, in 30 days, I want the plan, what I call the Indy recovery plan. What are we going to do to not just be able to qualify, but to qualify up front? And because we have the drivers that can do that. And so we've been going through that process since then. And I think there's good reason to believe we'll be very competitive this year. So, with the kind of talent that we have, even in 2018, Pietro, who was very young at the time, he qualified like 11th or something like that, or 12th. And, very good performance on an oval. And Christian, no question, Christian can run up front. But, at Indy, it's so dependent on the car. The car really has to be right for a driver to really shine there. And so, we fully expect to have cars that will allow our drivers to shine in 2024.
We were talking about this before the show. Your commitment to charitable causes is second to none. In full disclosure for audience, you, the Bobby Rahal Automotive Group, RLL Racing, and the Graham and Courtney Rahal Foundation have been very supportive of the nonprofit I co-founded, SoldierStrong. Bobby, through your auto dealerships alone, you host more than 75 charitable events each year and have donated well over $1 million to many worthy community causes. Near and dear to SoldierStrong is your relationship with United Rentals and the creation of Turns for Troops. Would you talk about both of them, United Rentals and Turns for Troops, please?
Well, great company, United Rentals. Fortunate to be introduced to them through Mike Lanigan. Just great people, great company, really great company. And I think we just, I think in our case, in Graham's case, really a great relationship between all three entities, especially between Graham and United Rentals. And of course, his support, their support of SoldierStrong has been tremendous. And, I think, I think as an individual, especially if you've had success, is, that there's a lot of people out there that haven't been lucky or haven't had the opportunity or, need that hand to help them up. And I've always felt, for many, many years that you kind of have an obligation to do that, to help people. And I know Graham, one of the things I'm most proud of Graham about is his charitable commitment, his efforts on behalf of not just SoldierStrong, but other charities. And SoldierStrong, I think, certainly would be the biggest one. And some of that's through United Rentals, some of it's through his own. He's got a golf tournament before Indy, as you know. that generates a fair amount of money for SoldierStrong, as well as One Cure, which is our other charity that we back on a yearly basis. So, I just think that's a must do, is to have that commitment to organizations that are out there helping people who need help. And of course, as you well know, seeing Sergeant Dan stand up, a veteran paralyzed in Afghanistan, and then thanks to your efforts and SoldierStrong as a whole, to see him get in the exoskeleton and walk across like 50 feet, 100 feet across the stage, or stand for the national anthem, right? At the start of the Indy 500. That's pretty amazing and pretty special. And it just makes you convinced that, that you're doing the right thing.
Well, Graham had two great teachers, both with you and a former neighbor of mine, Paul Newman, to learn from the best. And so Graham always references Paul Newman's book. And so I just appreciate what he learned from him and the legacy he passes on. Yeah. Bobby Rahal, it was an absolute honor to have you with us today. Really appreciate your time. I know how busy you are, so it was great catching up and great seeing you.
Thank you, Chris.
And thank you so much for our audience for being with us today, which now includes people in over 50 countries, for joining us for another episode of Next Steps Forward. For more details on upcoming shows and guests, please follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/Chris Meek Public Figure, and on X at Chris Meek_USA. We'll be back next Tuesday, same time, same place, with another leader from the world of business, politics, public policy, sports, or entertainment. Until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.